He thought he had her trapped, but within seconds the trap snapped back on him. The chamber was heavy with the stale air of political gamesmanship. The kind of room where silence feels sharper than words. Cameras hummed. Reporters leaned forward, and the audience on the other side of the lens was braced for spectacle. Mike Johnson, polished and rehearsed, wore the smile of a man who believed he had already won. His voice, steady but dripping with condescension, cut through the room like a blade meant to humiliate. "Congresswoman," he began, tilting his head with a smug precision. "Perhaps you'd like to explain how your position isn't riddled with contradictions, because here's where I stand, it doesn't hold together." It wasn't just a question, it was a trap, crafted for headlines, designed to corner her. Johnson leaned back, savoring the moment. His eyes scanned the crowd, silently asking them to enjoy the performance. He believed he had scripted this act down to its final beat. A confident speaker humiliating the younger, fiery Democrat, reducing her into a soundbite of defeat. But Jasmine Crockett did not move. She didn't fidget, didn't rush to speak, didn't offer him the satisfaction of visible discomfort. Her stillness was its own kind of power. The room, expecting her to stumble, suddenly noticed the calm fire building behind her eyes. Johnson's smirk widened, mistaking her silence for surrender. He tapped his notes, as if inviting her to struggle. What he didn't realize was that silence was her opening move, not his victory. For one suspended moment it was arrogance against patience, ego against composure. Viewers at home could feel the tightening coil of tension, like the seconds before a storm breaks. And then, with a voice steady enough to unnerve the most seasoned opponent, Crockett leaned toward the microphone. The air shifted, as though the entire room understood what was about to happen. What came next wasn't loud, it wasn't desperate, it was sharper than any insult and cleaner than any trap. Because Crockett was about to turn the tables, and when she did, even her critics fell silent. What Crockett did next silenced even her critics. The moment wasn't just another sparring match on Capitol Hill. It was a stage where power, truth, and dignity collided. To understand why the room's air felt charged, you have to understand who Mike Johnson is. Not just a man with a gavel, but the Speaker of the House, a position drenched in influence. He isn't merely another politician with opinions, he's the gatekeeper of what voices are amplified and what narratives are buried. His role isn't neutral, and he knows it. For Johnson, the microphone is not a tool of debate but a weapon, wielded with precision to control the story before the story controls him. For months, his style had been predictable: seize the floor, paint his opposition as contradictory, and wrap his words in an air of smug certainty. He thrived on the illusion that if you spoke with enough authority, the facts bent to your will. His speeches were less about substance and more about spectacle, and too often he got away with it. But across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, a woman who represented something bigger than policy. She was the face of a new kind of politics, unapologetically sharp, unafraid to confront arrogance, and unwilling to bow to the tricks of power. Where Johnson relied on manipulation, Crockett relied on clarity. Where he wielded performance, she carried truth like a shield. And on this day, the collision was inevitable. This wasn't just about a question of policy, it was about whose version of reality would survive. Johnson's strategy was simple: corner her with a question that seemed unanswerable, frame her as incoherent, and watch the cameras capture her supposed defeat. It was theater, the kind designed to trend on social media, to reinforce a narrative of his dominance. But what he didn't anticipate was the cultural weight behind this clash. For millions watching, Crockett wasn't just representing herself, she was standing for those who had been dismissed, talked over, and underestimated. She was carrying the weight of communities tired of arrogance, masquerading as leadership, of voices stifled by the illusion of authority. Every smirk Johnson flashed wasn't just aimed at her, it rippled outward, aimed at anyone who had ever been told they weren't smart enough, polished enough, or powerful enough to speak back. And that's why this moment mattered. It wasn't merely a debate tactic gone wrong. It was the exposure of an entire political playbook that relies on spectacle over sincerity. The stakes weren't limited to the four walls of that chamber. They stretched across living rooms, workplaces, and classrooms, where people watched and waited, silently hoping someone would finally puncture the bubble of arrogance that had too often gone unchecked. Johnson leaned in with what he believed was his masterstroke, a question that would box her in, a performance rehearsed for maximum humiliation. He saw the headlines already written, the viral clip of Jasmine Crockett stumbling under his verbal trap. But arrogance has a way of blinding its host. And as he leaned forward, savoring his own performance, He failed to notice the calm fire in Crockett's eyes, the signal that the tables were about to turn. Because when she finally spoke, it wasn't just an answer, it was a dismantling. But as Johnson leaned in with his so-called master move, Crockett's answer turned the tables before he even realized what happened. To understand why Mike Johnson walked into that chamber with such unshakable confidence, you have to trace the arc of his rise. He didn't climb the political ladder through charisma alone. His ascent was built on calculation, on carefully curating the image of a man who always appeared to have the moral and intellectual upper hand. From the moment he entered the political arena, Johnson projected himself as calm, scholarly, even righteous, a man who could package ideology into tidy, digestible soundbite. He wasn't the bomb thrower who shouted his way into headlines. He was the quiet strategist, the one who believed he could outthink, outmaneuver, and ultimately outsmart anyone who dared to challenge him. His career is a study in contrast. On one hand, he has cloaked himself in the language of integrity, morality, and faith. On the other, his record reveals a pattern of power plays designed not to build consensus, but to dominate. Behind the polished delivery, there is always calculation. When Johnson speaks, he doesn't just answer questions. He performs for history, imagining his words etched into the record as definitive, irrefutable, final. It's a persona that has fooled many, allowing him to appear reasonable while pursuing hardline positions that often leave no room for compromise. But perhaps the most telling part of his strategy is the way he deals with opponents. Johnson has long thrived on underestimation. He leans into a style of debate that assumes his adversary is either unprepared, too emotional, or too unpolished to withstand the weight of his carefully rehearsed lines. He banks on the silence that follows his statements, on the hesitation of those caught off guard by his composure. And too often it works. His opponents stumble, the audience buys the performance, and Johnson leaves with the satisfaction of having not just won, but humiliated. It was this pattern that shaped his approach to Jasmine Crockett. He saw in her the traits he believed he could exploit: passion, bluntness, a willingness to confront. To Johnson, those weren't strengths, they were vulnerabilities. He assumed he could push her into a corner where her passion would be painted as recklessness, her bluntness as incoherent. He mistook her authenticity for amateurism, her refusal to play the polished game as a weakness. But here lies the contradiction. For all his calculation, Johnson has blind spots. He presents himself as a man of principle, yet bends facts when it serves. He prides himself on being measured, yet cloaks arrogance in that calm exterior. He insists on civility, yet wields condescension like a weapon. This duality is what makes him formidable, and also deeply flawed. Because arrogance has a way of clouding perception, of convincing even the most strategic mind that the outcome has already been decided. His hypocrisy was visible long before this exchange. He spoke of respecting institutions while bending them for political gain. He talked of unity while sharpening divisions. He championed truth while spreading narratives that benefited his side, regardless of accuracy. Each move added to the illusion of mastery, reinforcing the idea that he was always 3 steps ahead. But illusions have limits, and Crockett was about to expose them. What Johnson failed to see was the difference between performance and presence. He was polished, yes, but Crockett was grounded. He rehearsed lines, she spoke truth. He built walls of rhetoric, she carried lived experience that could cut through any scripted trap. And while Johnson believed his gavel and title gave him authority, Crockett's calm fire proved that authority is hollow without authenticity. That's why his smirk that day wasn't just arrogance. It was the culmination of years of underestimating those he thought couldn't play his game. What he didn't realize was that Crockett wasn't there to play it at all. She was there to break it. And that is the fatal flaw of arrogance. It blinds you to the storm gathering on the horizon. But arrogance, as history always shows, has a fatal flaw. To understand why Jasmine Crockett sat in that chamber with such steady composure, you have to know where she came from. Her story is not one of privilege or entitlement. It's the story of someone who carved a place at the table through grit, resilience, and the refusal to let noise drown out dignity. Crockett was not born into power. She earned it step by step, often walking uphill, often walking alone, but always walking forward. Long before she became a national figure, she was a daughter, a student, a young woman looking at the world and deciding she would not be silenced. Education was her weapon, justice her calling. She trained as an attorney not to enrich herself, but to defend those who rarely had defenders. Her early cases were not glamorous or high-paying. They were gritty, thankless, the kind that placed her face to face with inequality in its rawest form. Yet those were the battles that sharpened her resolve. Every courtroom taught her to think quickly, speak precisely, and hold steady under pressure. She learned that silence can be strategy, that a pause can be more powerful than a paragraph, and that truth, when delivered with conviction, carries a weight no trick can match. Her rise into politics followed the same trajectory, uphill, unglamorous, but unstoppable. Crockett didn't enter Congress wrapped in polish and pedigree. She entered with scars from real fights. That authenticity is what made her magnetic to voters who felt invisible. She wasn't afraid of being direct. She wasn't afraid of being passionate. She wasn't afraid of being herself. And in a political world obsessed with theater, that honesty became her greatest strength. It also became the reason audiences connected with her so deeply. People saw in her the reflection of their own struggles. They saw someone who didn't come from a dynasty of influence, but from the reality of working for every inch of ground gained. They saw someone who could face mockery, interruption, and arrogance, and still hold herself with a composure that felt like dignity reborn. Every debate, every hearing, every confrontation reinforced her reputation, sharp wit, quick retorts, and an almost unshakable calm under fire. Where others might flinch, Crockett steadied. Where others might lash out, she measured. She embodied the lesson that strength is not the absence of emotion, but the mastery of it, and that mastery is precisely what made her the perfect foil to Mike Johnson. Because while he thrived on control and calculation, she thrived on presence and authenticity. He rehearsed traps. She carried lived truths. He believed he could script her downfall. She carried no script, only a reservoir of experience that could not be bent by his theatrics. Think of the contrast. Johnson's career was built on illusion, polished lines, manufactured calm. Crockett's was built on survival, real challenges, real scars. He relied on underestimation. She relied on the fact that she had been underestimated her entire life, and still rose. That's why audiences who watched her felt more than admiration. They felt validation. Every time she spoke, she gave voice to the frustration of those who had been told to wait their turn, to quiet down, to stay in their lane. She didn't just debate for herself. She debated for the millions who had been dismissed and demeaned. When Crockett held her ground, people watching at home felt as if they were holding theirs too. And so when she faced Johnson, it wasn't just another exchange across party lines. It was the collision of two archetypes. The polished manipulator, who assumed authority was his birthright, and the grounded fighter, who had earned every inch of credibility through sweat and scars. He believed he could rattle her with tricks. He didn't realize those tricks were nothing compared to what she had already faced. Because Crockett's life had been one long rehearsal for this very moment. Every courtroom where she outmaneuvered those who thought they were smarter. Every hearing where she cut through noise with precision. Every time she endured being underestimated, she had been sharpening the very weapon that now rested in her voice. And on this day it all converged. Her rise, her struggles, her reputation for wit and calm. It all came together in a single moment of truth. Johnson thought he had her trapped. He didn't see that she had been preparing for this confrontation long before he ever imagined it. And on this day, every part of her journey seemed to converge in one perfect, unforgettable reply. The trap was Johnson, convinced he had engineered the perfect moment, pressed forward with an almost theatrical energy. His voice sharpened, not loud but insistent, the cadence of a man who believed he had seized control of the narrative. He leaned in across the chamber table, punctuating his words with pointed jabs of his finger, every sentence dripping with the smug certainty of someone sure they had the upper hand. "Congresswoman," he pressed, "you see, the problem with your position is that it collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. You claim to defend fairness, yet your proposals achieve the exact opposite. You talk of dignity, yet your actions undermine it. How do you explain?" The words echoed, heavy and rehearsed, designed to corner and confuse. Johnson didn't wait for an answer. He cut the air with another volley. "The American people deserve clarity, and if you can't provide it, then perhaps your position is nothing more than noise." There was a ripple in the chamber. Staffers shifted in their seats. Reporters scribbled faster, and the murmurs of side comments swelled like a low tide. Some smirked, knowingly, convinced Johnson had landed his blow. Others exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the storm building beneath Crockett's stillness. Because while Johnson pressed harder, Crockett did not flinch. She didn't bite, didn't rush, didn't allow herself to be swept into the tempo he tried to impose. Instead, she sat anchored, her expression calm, almost serene. She let him talk. She let him interrupt. She let him dig. Every smirk, every interruption,
Every calculated jab only deepened the hole Johnson was unknowingly carving for himself.
Her silence was unnerving. The more she refused to react, the louder Johnson became, his composure thinning with every passing second. He leaned back in his chair with a smug grin, then leaned forward again, as though trying to physically corner her with his presence. His notes fluttered slightly in his hand, betraying the nervous energy beneath the performance. Observers noticed the contrast. Johnson's overconfidence felt theatrical, almost desperate. Crockett's composure, by contrast, carried the weight of inevitability. Even those who doubted her could sense it. Something was coming. A staffer whispered to another, "She's waiting. Just wait." A journalist near the back shook her head, muttering under her breath, "He doesn't see it. He really doesn't see it." The tension tightened, a coil ready to snap. Johnson pressed again, this time louder. "Well, where is your answer? Or is there no answer at all?" His smirk widened as though he were already savoring the clip that would circulate online, the moment he believed would humiliate her. But Crockett remained motionless, the fire in her eyes steady but contained. She had endured interruptions before, she had endured arrogance before, and she knew the power of patience. Johnson was building his own stage, and soon it would collapse beneath him. The silence stretched, and with it came a subtle shift. For the first time, Johnson's words seemed to bounce back hollow, their smugness more visible than persuasive. His act was wearing thin, and the room began to realize. The whispers grew louder, pens paused mid-sentence, eyes fixed not on Johnson's smirk but on Crockett's stillness. And then it happened. Crockett leaned forward, and the room braced for impact. Crockett leaned into the microphone, her movements deliberate, her eyes steady on Johnson. The chamber quieted almost instinctively, as if everyone in the room recognized that the temperature had shifted. For a moment, it was nothing, no words, no interruption, just silence thick enough to rattle even the most confident performer. Johnson's smirk held, but his eyes flickered with the smallest hesitation, the kind of crack in armor that only appears when the battlefield suddenly feels less secure. When Crockett finally spoke, her voice was calm, clear, and impossibly measured. "Miss Speaker," she began, pausing just long enough to let the title carry weight, "I find it interesting that you speak of contradictions when your entire approach to leadership has been one long contradiction." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Johnson blinked, his smirk twitching ever so slightly, but she did not relent. "You ask me about fairness," she continued, her cadence deliberate, slicing through the air with each word. "You say that what I propose is noise, yet fairness isn't found in rehearsed talking points. Fairness is found in whether or not the people we serve can look at this institution and believe it works for them. And right now, they don't. Not because of my proposals, but because of the kind of arrogance that assumes truth can be scripted." There was a pause, perfectly timed, heavy enough to make even the cameras seem to lean in. A cough echoed from the back row, then silence again. Crockett tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "You want to talk about contradictions? Let's talk about yours. You speak of morality while undermining the very trust of the people you claim to represent. You speak of dignity while dismissing those you think won't fight back. You champion unity while building walls out of division. That's not clarity, Mr. Speaker. That's theater." The air cracked. Some in the audience shifted in their seats. Others pressed lips together to hide a smile. The first suppressed laugh leaked from the press row, not out of mockery, but out of disbelief at the precision of her words. Johnson adjusted his notes, his grin faltering. "Congresswoman," he began, but she cut across him without raising her voice. "No, you've had your turn." The quiet authority of her tone landed heavier than any shout could have. The chamber stilled, even Johnson froze, startled by the firmness of her interjection. And then she pressed further. "You accuse me of contradictions, yet your question itself collapses under scrutiny. You wanted me to explain how I can defend fairness while pushing for change. But that question assumes the system as it stands is fair. It isn't, and you know it. What you call contradictions are actually corrections. Corrections to decades of inequality that leaders like you would rather ignore. So no, Mr. Speaker, I won't apologize for fighting for fairness. What I will do is remind you and anyone else listening that dismissing people as noise doesn't silence them. It only exposes your fear of what they're saying." The chamber erupted, not in applause because decorum restrained it, but in the unmistakable chorus of gasps. muttered wows and the audible clicks of reporters' keyboards racing to capture the moment. Johnson shifted in his seat, his shoulders stiff, his eyes darting quickly to the press gallery before snapping back to her. He forced a smile, but it landed wrong, too tight, too strained. His usual performance, the air of untouchable calm, was slipping. Crockett wasn't done. She leaned in further, her tone quieting, her words slowing, forcing every ear to follow her. You came here today expecting me to stumble. You rehearsed your trap, convinced the clip would belong to you. But here's the thing about arrogance. It blinds you. You don't see when the ground beneath you shifts. You don't hear the silence that builds before the fall. And you don't realize that the very moment you thought you had won is the moment you lose. The silence that followed was electric. Even her critics, those who bristled at her bluntness, could not deny the sheer precision of her takedown. A staffer in the corner whispered, "She just ended it." Another, trying not to laugh, muttered, "He asked for." On social media, clips of her words were already racing across timelines. Hashtags flared to life within minutes. Crockett cuts deep and Truth Over Theater began trending before Johnson even had a chance to respond. Screens across the country lit up with replay after replay of her dismantling his smug setup. Johnson tried to recover. "Well, Congresswoman, if you think lecturing," he started, his voice thinner now, his smile visibly forced. But she held up a hand, not theatrically but with the simplicity of authority. "No, Mr. Speaker, this isn't a lecture, it's clarity. Something this chamber hasn't had in far too long." Gasps. Suppressed laughter spilled into the room, not cruel but incredulous, as though the audience itself couldn't quite believe the reversal they were witnessing. Johnson, the master of control, the man who believed he had cornered her, was visibly unraveling. His smirk had vanished. His eyes, once steady, now darted, searching for footing. And Crockett, she simply leaned back, her silence this time a declaration, a punctuation mark that required no embellishment. In that instant, the tables were not just turned, they were flipped entirely. The clip Johnson imagined would humiliate Crockett was now the clip that defined his unraveling. What he had designed as a spectacle of dominance had become a case study in downfall. The crowd felt it, the press felt it, the viewers at home felt it. But what happened after the takedown, no one could have predicted. The chamber hadn't even cleared when the first ripples began. Within minutes, clips of Crockett's dismantling of Mike Johnson were circulating online, clipped into bite-sized moments of impact. One pause here, one piercing line there. Each snippet was powerful enough to stand alone, and together they painted a picture of a speaker stripped of his certainty. On Twitter, the hashtags bloomed instantly. Truth Over Theater vaulted to trending status. Then came Crockett Cuts Deep, a rallying cry for progressives who felt she had spoken their frustrations with surgical precision. Memes followed at lightning speed, Johnson's fading smirk frozen beside captions like, "When you think it's checkmate, but she's still holding the queen." TikTok lit up with reaction videos, young people laughing, cheering, and lip-syncing her words back as if they were lines from a cultural anthem. The validation was instant and overwhelming. "She said what we all wanted to say," read one viral post, racking up hundreds of thousands of likes. "Finally, someone who won't let them rewrite the truth," echoed another. For every carefully staged performance Johnson had built his reputation upon, Crockett's reply was a sledgehammer of authenticity that the public recognized on instinct. Cable news picked it up next. Pundits replayed the exchange frame by frame, analyzing Johnson's smile, the shift in his eyes, the way Crockett's calm delivery dismantled him without theatrics. On one progressive network, a commentator leaned forward and declared, "This wasn't just a comeback, it was a masterclass." Crockett exposed what happens when arrogance meets clarity. Even conservative outlets, though bristling, struggled to deny the resonance. One panelist sighed, "Whether you agree with her or not, she owned that moment." Johnson lost control. The shockwaves traveled beyond media. Allies in Congress, some of whom had grown weary of the constant battles, found a new spark. "She reminded us why we're here," one colleague whispered to reporters. Others, previously cautious about standing up to Johnson's maneuvering, felt emboldened. "If she can do that under pressure, so can we," became the quiet refrain in hallways and private meetings. Even critics were forced into a stunned silence. Those who had dismissed Crockett as too sharp or too fiery found themselves confronted with the undeniable effectiveness of her poise. For a moment, even the harshest detractors had to reckon with what they had just witnessed. Not noise, not bluster,
but precision so sharp it reshaped the narrative in real time. And outside Washington, the reaction was visceral. Immigrants, working families, communities long dismissed as background noise by those in power, saw themselves in her composure. She had voiced their frustration with the dismissiveness of leaders who smirked while people struggled. Her reply was more than personal. It was collective, a catharsis that audiences across the country could feel. Students posted late-night videos. "I've never watched congressional hearings, but this, I'll remember this." Parents commented on how they wanted their children to see Crockett as a model of dignity and strength. Activists called her words a blueprint for pushing back against manipulation without losing composure. The validation mattered, but so did the Johnson, a man who had built his reputation on controlling the stage, found himself defined by a moment he could not contain. In his camp, aides scrambled to spin the story, but every headline, every viral clip, every whisper in the Capitol corridors told the same truth. The speaker had underestimated his opponent, and in doing so he had underestimated the public's hunger for authenticity. The story wasn't just about one exchange anymore. It became a prism through which people examined the broader struggle between arrogance and dignity, manipulation and truth. Crockett's takedown carried weight, because it symbolized a larger fight, one that so many Americans felt personally invested in. And yet beneath the memes and the trending hashtags, something deeper stirred. Because Crockett's words weren't just a clapback, they carried a deeper lesson. In the aftermath of the clash, as the noise of memes and punditry began to settle, one truth stood above it all. Jasmine Crockett hadn't simply won a debate. She had reframed the entire moment. What looked at first like a showdown of personalities revealed itself to be something far more consequential, a test between arrogance and dignity, between manipulation and truth. Mike Johnson had approached the exchange as a performance, a theater of dominance, where clever phrasing could outshine substance. But Crockett's response stripped away the illusion. She reminded everyone watching that politics is not a stage for egos. It is a forum where the integrity of truth must stand against those who seek to twist it. Her composure, her choice to resist the bait, was more than tactical brilliance. It was moral clarity. In Crockett's calm, people saw a reflection of what America desperately needs. Leaders who will not mistake noise for power, who will not confuse performance with principle. Johnson had leaned into the arrogance of believing he could corner her. But as history so often demonstrates, arrogance collapses under the weight of dignity. His smirk faded, his confidence faltered, because in the end, manipulation is fragile. Truth, calmly spoken, outlasts it every time. This moment mattered not because it gave progressives a viral victory, or silenced a powerful speaker for a day. It mattered because it reminded the country what is worth fighting for. Crockett's reply was not for herself alone. It was for every immigrant who has been dismissed, every working family who has been talked over, every community told to wait their turn while politicians play games. She gave voice to those silenced by arrogance, and uplifted them with dignity. And audiences felt it. People saw themselves in her steadiness, her refusal to be shaken by cheap theatrics. They saw the possibility of a politics not driven by manipulation, but by a steady insistence on truth. This is why the moment struck so deeply. It was not just a clapback. It was a reminder that America's best moments are not defined by the loudest voice in the room, but by the clearest conscience. Crockett's victory was not about silencing Johnson. It was about showing that arrogance, no matter how rehearsed, is powerless when confronted with authentic conviction. The lesson is universal. Noise fades, truth, and in that endurance, there is hope. Hope that dignity is not weakness, but strength, that calm is not surrender but a form of power stronger than rage. The moral clarity of that moment cannot be overstated. Crockett proved that in an era where manipulation is currency, authenticity is still priceless. That is why people shared the clip, why hashtags erupted, why commentators struggled to find words. It was not just about a single victory. It was about reclaiming the idea that leadership should not be measured by who can talk over whom, but by who can speak with unshakable conviction. And that is why this moment will be remembered far beyond politics. Mike Johnson tried to outsmart Jasmine Crockett, but the tables turned instantly. What began as his smug attempt to box her in, ended as a showcase of how arrogance collapses under the weight of intelligence and dignity. He thought he held the stage. Instead, Crockett rewrote the script. That's why this moment matters. It wasn't just about a speaker miscalculating in public. It was about the reminder that no amount of performance, no smirk, no rhetorical trick, can outlast truth, spoken spoken with clarity. Crockett didn't just counter Johnson's move. She exposed the fragility of arrogance itself, and in doing so she offered something bigger than a debate victory. She offered a vision of leadership, rooted in calm conviction and respect for the truth. For those who watched, the message was unmistakable. When power tries to corner you, stand firm. When arrogance tries to silence you, let dignity speak. This wasn't just her win. It was a validation for everyone who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told to shrink in the face of authority. And now it's up to us to keep that moment alive. If you believe in amplifying voices like Jasmine Crockett's, voices that cut through the noise with courage and clarity, then share this story. Subscribe, be part of this community, and help spread the message that truth still matters, that dignity is still powerful, and that arrogance never has the last word. Because when arrogance sets the trap, dignity walks free.